Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Curtis Hicks stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard waiting to be conquered. At 38, he had built Hicks Security Solutions from nothing into a multi-million-dollar private security firm that protected celebrities, politicians, and corporate executives. His reputation was built on two pillars: absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty to those who earned it. Curtis had learned early that trust was a currency more valuable than gold. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of South Chicago, he watched his father work 3 jobs to keep food on the table, only to have his mother run off with a smooth-talking salesman when Curtis was 12. The lesson was burned into his soul. Betrayal was the ultimate sin, and those who committed it deserved no mercy. "Mr. Hicks?" His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your wife is here to see you." A rare smile crossed Curtis's weathered face. Sandra Grace Hicks was the one person who had managed to penetrate his carefully constructed walls. They'd met 5 years ago at a charity gala where she was volunteering as an event coordinator. Unlike the other women who threw themselves at successful men, Sandra had been genuine, funny, and seemingly unimpressed by his wealth. She'd made him work for every smile, every laugh, every moment of her time. Sandra entered his office with a graceful confidence that had first caught his attention. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light, and her emerald eyes sparkled with mischief. At 32, she still turned heads wherever she went, but Curtis had been the one to win her heart, or so he believed. "Busy day, Mr. Important?" she teased, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Never too busy for you," Curtis replied, meaning every word. "What brings you downtown?" "I was shopping with your sister and thought I'd surprise you." Sandra's smile seemed forced, but Curtis attributed it to fatigue. "Geraldine mentioned you might be working late again tonight." Curtis nodded, already feeling the familiar pang of guilt. His work consumed him, but it was for Sandra and their future children. He'd been planning to propose for months, waiting for the perfect moment. The ring sat in his office safe, a 3-carat diamond that had cost more than most people made in a year. "How about we grab dinner tomorrow? That new place on 5th Street. Curtis suggested, already mentally rearranging his schedule. "I'd love that." Sandra's response came quickly, but her eyes darted to her phone as it buzzed. "Oh, that's Geraldine. I should run." After Sandra left, Curtis tried to focus on the quarterly reports spread across his desk, but something nagged at him. His sister Geraldine had been acting strange lately, avoiding his calls and giving short answers when they did speak. As someone who'd built a career on reading people, Curtis prided himself on noticing details others missed. Later that evening, Curtis's phone rang as he was leaving the office. The caller ID showed his brother-in-law Phil Ott, married to his younger sister Geraldine. "Curtis, I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" Phil's voice was strained, almost fearful. "What's wrong?" "Not over the phone. Just come over. Please." The drive to Phil and Geraldine's suburban home took 40 minutes through traffic. Curtis found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. Phil met him at the door, his face pale and drawn. "Where's Geraldine?" Curtis asked immediately. She went to her book club." "Curtis, I don't know how to tell you this." Phil's hand shook as he poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "Maybe you should sit down." Curtis remained standing, his body coiled like a spring. "Just say it. It's about Sandra. I saw her." "Christ, Curtis, I saw her with another man. They were at the Morrison Hotel, and they weren't just talking." The words hit Curtis like physical blows. His vision narrowed, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Tell me everything." Phil's story unfolded like a nightmare. He'd been meeting a client at the Morrison Hotel's restaurant when he'd seen Sandra in the elevator with a man Phil didn't recognize. Their body language was intimate, familiar. When Phil had discreetly followed, he'd watched them enter a room together. "I waited 2 hours," Phil continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They came out looking, well, like they'd been doing exactly what you'd think. Curtis felt something inside him snap, but his training kicked in. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when information was needed. Describe the man. Tall, probably 6'2", dark hair, expensive suit. Mid-30s, maybe. He walked like he was military or law enforcement. The description sent ice through Curtis's veins. It sounded like Damon Barker, a former FBI agent who'd started his own investigation firm 6 months ago. Curtis had met him at a professional conference, and they discussed potentially collaborating on cases that required both security and investigative expertise. Phil, I need you to promise me something. You don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not Geraldine, not anyone. Can you do that? Phil nodded quickly. Of course. Curtis, I'm sorry. I know how much you love her. Love. The word tasted like ash in Curtis's mouth. He'd loved Sandra with a devotion that bordered on worship, had been planning to give her everything he'd built, everything he was. But love, he learned long ago, was a weakness that others would exploit. I need to go, Curtis said, already moving toward the door. Remember what I said about keeping this quiet. As Curtis drove home, his mind began working with the cold precision that had made him successful. If Sandra was betraying him, she wasn't just breaking his heart. She was making a declaration of war. And wars, Curtis knew, were won by the side that was more ruthless, more prepared, and more willing to do whatever it took to achieve victory. He would need proof, evidence that would stand up in court when the time came. But more than that, he would need a plan that would make Sandra and her lover understand the true cost of betraying Curtis Hicks. Chapter 2. The Web of Deception. Curtis spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled fury, maintaining his normal routine while his mind churned with plans for investigation and revenge. His security firm had access to surveillance equipment that would make the FBI jealous, and he intended to use every resource at his disposal. The first step was confirmation. Despite Phil's eyewitness account, Curtis needed irrefutable proof before he could move forward. He installed a discreet GPS tracker on Sandra's car, tapped her phone with software that would make NSA technicians proud, and activated a network of contacts who owed him favors throughout the city. The evidence came faster than he'd expected. Sandra's movements painted a clear picture. Regular visits to the Morrison Hotel, always on days when Curtis would be working late. Phone records showed a pattern of calls to a number registered to Damon Barker's firm. Text messages, recovered through sophisticated software, were damning in their intimacy. But Curtis discovered something that made his blood freeze. The affair wasn't recent. It had been going on for over a year. Sandra had been playing the loving girlfriend while secretly meeting Barker almost weekly. Every shopping trip, every girl's night out, every excuse had been a carefully constructed lie. Even worse, Curtis found evidence that Sandra had been feeding information about his business to Barker. Client lists, security protocols, even details about his personal finances, all of it had been shared with her lover. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional espionage. On Thursday evening, Curtis sat in his home office, surrounded by printed emails, photographs, and financial records. His phone rang, and Sandra's face appeared on the screen, smiling at him from a photo taken during their vacation in Tuscany last year. Hey, honey. Her voice was warm, affectionate. I know you're working late, but I wanted to hear your voice. Hi, beautiful, Curtis replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. How was your day? Oh, boring stuff. I had lunch with Kathleen Jones from the charity board, then spent the afternoon at the spa. I'm exhausted. Curtis looked at the photograph on his desk, showing Sandra entering the Morrison Hotel at 2:47 p.m., her hand intertwined with Damon Barker's. The timestamp showed she'd been there for 3 hours. That sounds relaxing, he said. I should be home by 9. I'll wait up for you, Sandra purred. I've missed you. After ending the call, Curtis poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and began formulating his plan. Simple revenge wouldn't be enough. Sandra and Barker had conspired to betray him in the most fundamental way possible, and they would pay accordingly. The next morning, Curtis called his sister Geraldine, asking her to meet him for lunch. They sat in a quiet booth at an upscale restaurant, and Curtis studied his sister's face as she spoke about her volunteer work and Phil's recent promotion. "Geraldine," Curtis said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Her face paled slightly. "What is it? How long have you known about Sandra's affair?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Geraldine's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, and Curtis had his answer before she spoke. How long, Geraldine?" His voice was quiet, but his sister recognized the tone. She'd heard it before, years ago, when someone had tried to cheat Curtis out of his first major business deal. 6 months, she whispered. "Maybe longer. I wanted to tell you, but Sandra begged me not to. She said it was over, that she was going to break it off." Curtis felt another piece of his heart turn to stone. His own sister had been part of the conspiracy, had looked him in the eye and lied for months. The betrayal was expanding, reaching into every corner of his life. "Who else knows? Just Phil and me. I swear, Curtis, I never wanted to hurt you. Sandra said you'd been distant, that you cared more about work than her." "Stop." Curtis's voice cut through her explanations like a blade. "Don't you dare try to justify this." Geraldine began to cry, but Curtis felt nothing. The woman across from him was no longer his sister. She was another enemy who had chosen sides in a war she didn't understand. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Curtis. I never meant for it to go this far." Curtis stood up, dropping a $50 bill on the table. "You made your choice, Geraldine. Live with it." That afternoon, Curtis received an unexpected visitor. Damon Barker stood in his office reception area, looking confident and relaxed. He was exactly as Phil had described, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. Hicks," Barker extended his hand. "I was hoping we could discuss some potential collaboration opportunities." Curtis shook the man's hand, noting the firm grip and steady eye contact. Barker was good at his job, Curtis had to admit. The man was standing in the office of the husband he was cuckolding, discussing business with perfect composure. "Of course," Curtis replied smoothly. "What did you have in mind?" For the next hour, Barker outlined several cases where their firms could work together. Corporate espionage investigations, executive protection with investigative support, even potential government contracts. The irony wasn't lost on Curtis. The man who was betraying him was also trying to profit from their association. "I think we could do great things together," Barker concluded. "I believe in building relationships based on trust and mutual benefit." Curtis smiled, and for a moment, Barker seemed unsettled by the expression. "Trust is indeed the foundation of any successful partnership, Mr. Barker. I've always believed that people who betray trust should face consequences." "Absolutely," Barker agreed, missing the subtle threat entirely. Disloyalty is a cancer that destroys everything it touches. After Barker left, Curtis made 3 phone calls. The first was to a contact in the district attorney's office, a man who owed Curtis several favors. The second was to a private investigator who specialized in cases that required flexible ethical standards. The third was to a number that wasn't listed in any directory, to a man who solved problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. By evening, Curtis had assembled a team of professionals who would help him orchestrate the complete destruction of Sandra Grace and Damon Barker. But first, he needed to set the stage for the final act of this elaborate drama. Chapter 3: The Trap Springs. Curtis spent the weekend playing the role of the loving boyfriend with Oscar-worthy performance. He took Sandra to their favorite restaurant, bought her expensive jewelry, and made love to her with a passion that surprised even him. But beneath the surface, he was studying her like a lab specimen, cataloging every lie, every false smile, every moment of deception. On Monday morning, Curtis implemented the first phase of his plan. He called Sandra from his office, his voice filled with excitement. "Darling, I have incredible news. Remember that government contract I've been pursuing? The one for embassy security in Eastern Europe?" "Of course," Sandra replied, though Curtis could hear the distraction in her voice. She was probably texting Barker. "I got it. $20 million over 3 years. This is going to change everything for us." Curtis paused for effect. "I'm going to need someone I trust completely," to help me manage the operational details. Someone who knows my business inside and out. Curtis, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. There's more. I've been thinking about our future, about what we mean to each other. Sandra, I want to make this official. I want to make you my partner in every sense of the word. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. What do you mean? I mean marriage, Sandra. I want to marry you, and I want you to be my business partner. Full access to everything, complete transparency. We'll be a team in every way possible. Curtis could almost hear Sandra's mind racing. The prospect of marrying a man worth tens of millions while maintaining her affair with Barker would be too tempting to resist. She would see it as the ultimate victory, having both the financial security Curtis provided and the passion she found with her lover. Curtis, this is so sudden. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Say yes, Sandra. Say you'll marry me. Yes, she whispered, and Curtis could hear the tears in her voice. Real tears, which made her betrayal even more despicable. Yes, of course I'll marry you. That afternoon, Curtis met with his team in a secure conference room. The group included Luther Baker, a former military intelligence officer who now handled special projects, and Myron King, a cybersecurity expert who could manipulate digital evidence with surgical precision. Gentlemen, Curtis began, I need you to understand that what we're about to do operates in several gray areas of the law. Anyone who's uncomfortable with that can leave now with full payment and no questions asked. No one moved. Good. Here's what we're going to do. In 3 days, I'm hosting an engagement party at my house. Sandra and Damon Barker will both be there, along with approximately 50 other guests. During that party, certain revelations will come to light that will destroy both of them completely. Curtis outlined his plan in detail. Luther would handle the physical aspects, while Myron would manage the digital evidence. Other team members would ensure that key witnesses were in place and that law enforcement arrived at precisely the right moment. What about your sister? Luther asked. She's been part of the deception. Curtis's expression hardened. Geraldine made her choice when she decided to help Sandra lie to me. She'll face the consequences along with the rest of them. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Curtis arranged for Sandra to spend the afternoon at an exclusive spa while he handled the party preparations. In reality, he was supervising the installation of hidden cameras throughout his house and ensuring that every conversation would be recorded in high-definition clarity. Sandra returned home that evening glowing with excitement, babbling about wedding plans and their future together. Curtis listened with the detached interest of a scientist observing a fascinating but ultimately doomed specimen. I invited Damon Barker to the party, Sandra mentioned casually as they prepared for bed. I hope that's okay. I thought it might be good for your business relationship. Of course, Curtis replied. The more the merrier. Sandra smiled and kissed him goodnight, her lips soft and warm against his. Curtis wondered if she felt any guilt at all, or if the capacity for remorse had been bred out of her entirely. The morning of the party, Curtis woke before dawn and went to his home office. He opened his safe and removed the engagement ring he'd bought months ago, holding it up to the light. 3 carats of perfect clarity, set in platinum, worth more than most people's cars. He'd imagined sliding it on his Sandra's finger, seeing her face light up with joy and love. Instead, he placed it in a small velvet box and put it in his jacket pocket. It would serve a different purpose now. By evening, Curtis's house was filled with guests. Business associates, old friends, family members, all gathered to celebrate what they believed was a joyous occasion. Sandra wore a stunning red dress that hugged her curves perfectly, playing the role of the radiant bride-to-be with masterful precision. Damon Barker arrived at 8 o'clock, looking handsome and confident. He congratulated Curtis with apparent sincerity, shook hands with Sandra as if they were casual acquaintances, and mingled with the other guests with practiced ease. At 9:30, Curtis called for everyone's attention. He stood in the center of his living room, Sandra at his side, holding a glass of champagne. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. You're here to celebrate my engagement to Sandra, but before we make this official, I want to share something with all of you. Curtis reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. You see, I've recently discovered some very interesting information about trust, loyalty, and the true nature of the people we think we know. Sandra's face began to pale, but she maintained her smile. Across the room, Damon Barker straightened slightly, his police training kicking in. For the past year, Curtis continued, I've been betrayed by someone I trusted completely. Someone who took my love, my faith, and my loyalty, and threw it all away for a quick thrill with another man. The room fell silent. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Curtis opened the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs. High-resolution images of Sandra and Damon entering hotel rooms, kissing in parking garages, holding hands in restaurants across the city. Ladies and gentlemen, Curtis announced, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever, I present to you Sandra Grace and Damon Barker, who have been conducting an affair for over a year while Sandra pretended to love me. The explosion of gasps and murmurs filled the room. Sandra's face went white, and she reached for Curtis's arm, but he stepped away from her. Curtis, please let me explain. Oh, you'll have plenty of time to explain, Curtis said calmly. You see, Sandra, your lover, Mr. Barker, isn't just an adulterer. He's also a criminal. Curtis nodded to Luther, who stepped forward with another envelope. While conducting surveillance on Mr. Barker, my team discovered something interesting. He's been using his investigative firm to run an identity theft operation, stealing personal information from his clients and selling it to organized crime families. Damon Barker's face went from confused to terrified in seconds. That's not true. Curtis, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but the FBI will be very interested in the evidence we've compiled, Curtis continued relentlessly. Bank records, encrypted communications, even recorded conversations with known criminals. It's all very thoroughly documented. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder as they approached the house. Curtis had timed everything perfectly. But wait, he said, pulling out the velvet ring box. There's more. Sandra, my dear, sweet Sandra, I know you've been providing Mr. Barker with classified information about my clients. Corporate espionage is a federal crime, punishable by up to 20 years in prison. Sandra collapsed into a chair, her perfect facade finally cracking. Curtis, please, I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you. Love. Curtis's voice was like ice. You don't know the meaning of the word. The siren stopped outside, and Curtis could see flashing red and blue lights through his windows. Federal agents would be at his door within minutes, armed with warrants for both Sandra and Damon's arrest. There's one more thing, Curtis said, turning to address the room. My sister Geraldine has been helping Sandra cover up this affair for months. She chose to betray her own brother for a woman who was using both of us. Geraldine, who had been standing near the kitchen, burst into tears. Curtis, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't repair broken trust, Geraldine. Sorry doesn't undo betrayal. The doorbell rang, and Curtis walked calmly to answer it. 6 federal agents stood on his porch, their faces stern and professional. Curtis had provided them with enough evidence to ensure that both Sandra and Damon would face serious federal charges. As the agents entered his house and began reading Sandra and Damon their rights, Curtis felt a cold satisfaction wash over him. This was justice, not just revenge. They had declared war on him, and now they would face the consequences. Sandra looked at him one last time as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Curtis, please. I know I hurt you, but this is too much. I'm begging you. Curtis stared at her with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness, no trace of the love he'd once felt. You made your choice, Sandra. Now live with it. As the agents led Sandra and Damon away, Curtis turned to face his remaining guests. Some looked horrified, others impressed, but all of them understood one thing. Curtis Hicks was not a man to be crossed. The party was over, but Curtis's work was just beginning. This was only the first phase of his revenge, and he intended to make sure that everyone who had betrayed him would pay the full price for their treachery. Chapter 4. The Reckoning begins. 3 weeks after the arrests, Curtis sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the legal proceedings that would seal Sandra and Damon's fate. The federal prosecutors had been more than happy to work with Curtis, especially given the quality of evidence his team had provided. The identity theft charges against Barker are solid, his attorney, Ricardo Randolph, explained. 15 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of identity theft, and conspiracy charges. He's looking at 25 to 30 years minimum. Curtis nodded with satisfaction. The evidence against Barker had been meticulously crafted by his team, woven together with just enough real criminal activity to make the fabricated elements undetectable. Barker had been sloppy in his real business dealings, providing the perfect foundation for Curtis's more elaborate frame job. And Sandra. The corporate espionage charges are more complex, but given the classified nature of your client information and the evidence of her passing it to Barker, she's facing 10 to 15 years. The prosecutors are particularly interested in the national security implications. Curtis had been careful to ensure that Sandra's crimes were real, even if her motivations had been manipulated. She had indeed shared confidential client information with Barker, ostensibly for their personal relationship, but legally constituting espionage. The fact that Curtis had guided her into these actions through careful manipulation was irrelevant to the courts. Have either of them attempted to contact me? Both have tried multiple times through their attorneys. Barker claims he's been framed, and Sandra. Ricardo paused, consulting his notes. Sandra wants to speak with you personally. She says she has information that could help your business. Curtis smiled coldly. Even facing decades in prison, Sandra was still trying to manipulate him. Tell both attorneys that I have no interest in any communication with their clients. My testimony will be limited to what's required by law. After leaving the lawyer's office, Curtis drove to his sister Geraldine's house. She'd been calling him daily since the arrests, but he'd ignored every attempt at communication. Today, however, he had a purpose for seeing her. Phil answered the door, his face haggard and drawn. Curtis, thank God you're here. Geraldine's been. She's not taking any of this well. Curtis followed Phil into the living room, where Geraldine sat curled in a chair, staring at nothing. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. Curtis, please, she whispered. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I'm your sister. We're family. Family doesn't lie to each other, Geraldine. Family doesn't help outsiders betray their own blood. I was trying to protect you. Sandra said you'd be devastated if you found out, that it would destroy you. So you decided to let me continue living a lie? Curtis's voice was perfectly controlled, but the anger beneath it was volcanic. You watched me plan a future with a woman who was betraying me, and you said nothing. Geraldine began to cry again, but Curtis felt nothing. The woman in front of him was no longer his sister. She was another enemy who had chosen the wrong side. I'm cutting all ties with you, Geraldine. You're no longer my sister, and I'm no longer your brother. Don't contact me again. Curtis, you can't mean that. We're family. We're all the family each other has. Curtis turned to Phil, who was standing in the doorway, looking stricken. Phil, I genuinely liked you. You tried to do the right thing by telling me the truth. But you're married to her, which makes you my enemy by association. Curtis, please. If either of you comes near me, my home, or my business, I'll have you arrested for harassment. If you try to contact me through third parties, I'll make your lives very difficult in ways you can't imagine. Curtis left without another word, closing the door on his past and the people who had betrayed him. The Hicks family line would die with him, but that was preferable to maintaining relationships with people who had proven their disloyalty. The next phase of his plan required patience and careful timing. Curtis had studied Sandra and Damon's psychological profiles extensively, and he knew that their imprisonment was only the beginning of their punishment. True justice required something more personal, more devastating than mere incarceration. 2 months into their prison sentences, Curtis received word that Sandra had been placed in protective custody after several violent incidents with other inmates. Female prisoners, he'd learned, had little tolerance for women who betrayed their men. Damon, meanwhile, had been transferred to a maximum security facility after being attacked by inmates who didn't appreciate former law enforcement officers. Curtis felt a deep satisfaction knowing that both of them were suffering, but he wasn't finished. Using his extensive network of contacts, he began to orchestrate a more subtle form of torment. Anonymous letters began arriving at the prison, each one containing photographs of Sandra and Damon together, along with detailed descriptions of their betrayal. Other inmates learned about their crimes through carefully planted information. Their commissary accounts were mysteriously emptied. Legal documents were lost or misfiled, delaying appeals and parole hearings. Curtis also ensured that their families faced consequences. Damon's elderly mother found herself under IRS investigation for tax irregularities that Curtis's team had carefully documented. Sandra's younger brother lost his job when his employer received anonymous tips about his association with a federal criminal. The web of revenge spread outward, touching everyone who had been connected to the betrayal. Curtis's resources were vast, and his patience was infinite. He would spend years, even decades, ensuring that Sandra and Damon's punishment continued long after their prison sentences ended. But the most satisfying revenge was yet to come. Curtis had learned that Sandra was pregnant, a fact that the prison medical staff had discovered during routine testing. The father was almost certainly Damon, though Curtis supposed it could have been him. Either way, the child would grow up knowing that both parents were federal criminals who had betrayed the one man who had truly loved them. Curtis arranged for the child to be placed in an adoption agency that he secretly controlled. The adoptive parents would be good people, but they would never know the truth about the child's origins. Sandra would spend the rest of her life knowing that her child was out there somewhere, being raised by strangers, while she rotted in prison for her crimes. As Curtis sat in his office that evening, he reflected on the events of the past year. He had lost everything that mattered to him: his wife-to-be, his sister, his faith in human decency. But he had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that betrayal came with a price, and that price would be paid in full. The intercom buzzed, and his secretary's voice filled the room. "Mr. Hicks, there's a young woman here to see you. She says her name is Lee Shoemaker, and she's here about a security position." Curtis smiled for the first time in months. Life would go on, and perhaps there would be room for someone new in his carefully controlled world. But this time, he would be more careful about whom he trusted. The lessons of betrayal had been learned, and they would never be forgotten. Chapter 5. The Deeper Game. 6 months after Sandra and Damon's convictions, Curtis received an unexpected visitor that would change everything. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his secretary announced that a federal agent was requesting an immediate meeting. Agent Monique Stark was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an all-business demeanor. She entered Curtis's office carrying a thick briefcase and wearing an expression that immediately put him on high alert. "Mr. Hicks, I'm Agent Stark with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. I need to discuss some concerning information that's come to light during our investigation of Damon Barker." Curtis maintained his composure, though his mind began racing through possibilities. "Of course, Agent Stark. How can I help?" "During our investigation of Mr. Barker's identity theft operation, we discovered something troubling. It appears that you and your security firm were among his targets." Curtis felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Agent Stark opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Barker had been systematically gathering information about your clients, your business operations, and your personal finances for over 18 months. We found detailed dossiers on your most sensitive clients, including several who work in classified government positions." The implications hit Curtis like a sledgehammer. If Barker had been investigating him professionally, their entire relationship, including Sandra's affair, might have been orchestrated as part of a larger operation. "Agent Stark, I provided the evidence that led to Barker's arrest. Are you suggesting that I was somehow involved in his crimes?" "Not at all, Mr. Hicks. We believe you were the target, not the perpetrator. But we need to understand how deep this goes. The information Barker compiled could have compromised national security." Curtis's mind raced through the implications. If Sandra's affair had been part of a larger intelligence operation, then everything he thought he knew about the betrayal was wrong. The personal devastation he'd felt might have been engineered by professionals who saw him as a target rather than a victim. "What kind of information did Barker have?" "Details about your security protocols, client lists, even your personal habits and psychological profile." Someone was paying him to compile a comprehensive intelligence package on you and your organization. Agent Stark spread several documents across Curtis's desk. The level of detail was staggering. Financial records, psychological assessments, even photographs of his daily routines taken with telephoto lenses. Who was paying him? That's what we're trying to determine. The money was routed through several shell companies, ultimately traced back to offshore accounts. We believe it was foreign intelligence, but we need your help to identify who might see you as a target. Curtis studied the documents, his anger building with each revelation. He'd been played on a level he hadn't even imagined. Sandra's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional espionage of the highest order. Given the nature of your clients, Agent Starr continued, we believe you may have been targeted by multiple foreign intelligence services. Your security firm protects people who have access to classified information, military secrets, and sensitive government operations. You're saying Sandra was a foreign agent? We don't know yet. She may have been an unwitting asset, recruited by Barker and manipulated into providing information. Or she may have been a professional operative from the beginning. That's what we need to find out. Curtis felt his world tilting on its axis. Everything he believed about Sandra, about their relationship, about the betrayal, all of it might have been an elaborate intelligence operation designed to compromise him and his clients. What do you need from me? Full cooperation. We need access to your security protocols, your client communications, and any information you might have about how Sandra and Barker operated. We also need you to be extremely careful about your personal security. If foreign intelligence services are involved, you could be in physical danger. After Agent Stark left, Curtis sat alone in his office, staring at the documents spread across his desk. His carefully planned revenge suddenly seemed naive and small-scale compared to the larger game being played around him. His phone rang, and the caller ID showed his private investigator, Luther Baker. Curtis, we need to talk. I've been digging deeper into Sandra's background, and I found something that doesn't add up. What is it? Sandra Grace isn't her real name. Her birth certificate, her college records, even her social security number, they're all fabricated. Professional-grade identity creation, the kind that requires government-level resources. Curtis felt the pieces clicking into place. How long has she been using this identity? At least 7 years, maybe longer. Whoever created Sandra Grace did a masterful job. She has a complete life history, financial records, even social media accounts that go back years. This is an amateur hour, Curtis. This is professional intelligence work. Curtis's hands clenched into fists. He'd been manipulated by professionals who had studied him, learned his weaknesses, and deployed Sandra like a weapon against him. The woman he'd loved had never existed. She was a carefully constructed lie designed to destroy him. Luther, I want you to dig deeper. I want to know everything about who Sandra really is, who sent her, and what they wanted from me. Use every resource we have. Already on it. But Curtis, if foreign intelligence is involved, this goes way beyond what we can handle alone. These people don't just ruin lives, they eliminate threats. After ending the call, Curtis walked to his window and stared out at the city below. Everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. His personal revenge against Sandra and Damon now seemed like a sideshow compared to the larger threat he faced. But Curtis Hicks hadn't built a security empire by backing down from dangerous situations. If foreign operatives wanted to play games with him, he would show them what a truly ruthless opponent looked like. Chapter 6. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. The revelation that Sandra was a foreign operative fundamentally changed Curtis's approach to revenge. This was no longer about a cheating girlfriend and her lover. This was about national security, professional survival, and the complete destruction of an intelligence network that had targeted him. Curtis spent the next week reviewing every interaction he'd had with Sandra, looking for clues he'd missed. Luther's team had compiled a comprehensive analysis of her activities, and the picture that emerged was chilling in its sophistication. Sandra had been placed in Curtis's path through a carefully orchestrated series of coincidences. The charity gala where they'd met hadn't been random. She'd been volunteering there specifically to encounter him. Her resistance to his advances, which he'd found so attractive, had been calculated to make him pursue her more aggressively. She played you perfectly, Luther reported during their morning briefing. Every conversation, every intimate moment, every shared experience was designed to gather intelligence about your operations. Curtis studied the psychological profile his team had developed. Sandra had been trained to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities. His well-known loyalty to family had been used against him through Geraldine. His need for trust had been weaponized to make him share confidential information. What about Damon Barker? Barker's real, but he was recruited by Sandra, not the other way around. She seduced him and convinced him to help gather intelligence. He thought he was involved in corporate espionage for financial gain, not realizing he was working for foreign intelligence. Curtis felt a grudging respect for the operation's complexity. Sandra had managed 2 separate relationships, maintaining perfect operational security while gathering massive amounts of sensitive information. She was a professional of the highest caliber. Have we identified which country she's working for? Still working on it, but the evidence points to a consortium of Eastern European intelligence services. They're particularly interested in your government clients, the defense contractors, the intelligence officials, the politicians you've provided security for. Curtis's client list read like a who's who of American national security. Senators, generals, CIA officials, defense industry executives. All of them have been potentially compromised through his relationship with Sandra. That afternoon, Curtis received another visit from Agent Stark, this time accompanied by a man who introduced himself only as Director Phillips from an unnamed government agency. "Mr. Hicks," Phillips began, "we need to discuss the extent of the intelligence breach you've suffered. Some of your clients are involved in programs that could compromise national security if their information has been leaked." Curtis spread his hands. "Gentlemen, I've provided full cooperation with your investigation. What more do you need? We need you to help us turn this situation to our advantage," Agent Stark explained. "Sandra Grace, or whatever her real name is, doesn't know that we've uncovered her true identity. As far as she knows, she's in prison for corporate espionage, not espionage against the United States." Phillips leaned forward. "We want you to make contact with her. Convince her that you've forgiven her, that you want to help with her legal defense. We need to identify her handlers and learn the full scope of what she's compromised." Curtis considered the proposal. Using his access to Sandra to gather intelligence was appealing, but it would require him to suppress his desire for immediate revenge in favor of a longer-term strategy. "What's in it for me?" "Complete immunity from any charges related to the intelligence breach, plus full government protection for you and your business," Phillips replied. "We'll also ensure that Sandra and her entire network face the full consequences of their actions." Curtis smiled coldly. "That's a start, but I want more. I want the resources to hunt down everyone involved in this operation. I want them to pay for targeting me, and I want their suffering to be comprehensive and permanent." The 2 agents exchanged glances. "Mr. Hicks, we're talking about intelligence professionals backed by foreign governments. This isn't a corporate dispute that can be resolved through legal channels." "I'm not talking about legal channels," Curtis replied quietly. "I'm talking about the kind of justice that people like Sandra understand, the kind that makes examples out of those who betray trust." Director Phillips studied Curtis carefully. "You're proposing to wage a personal war against an intelligence network. I'm proposing to eliminate a threat to American national security while satisfying my own need for justice. Sometimes personal and professional interests align perfectly." After a long pause, Phillips nodded. "We can work with that, Mr. Hicks, but you'll be operating under our oversight, and you'll follow our rules." Curtis's smile widened. "Director Phillips, I think you'll find that my rules and your objectives are perfectly compatible." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Curtis would visit Sandra in prison, playing the role of the heartbroken lover seeking closure. He would gradually convince her that he still cared for her, that he wanted help with her legal defense, and that he was willing to forgive her betrayal. Once Sandra trusted him again, Curtis would use that trust to identify her handlers, learn about other operations she'd been involved in, and gather intelligence about the broader network that had targeted him. But Curtis had no intention of limiting himself to gathering intelligence. Every person involved in Sandra's operation would face personal consequences that went far beyond legal prosecution. He would destroy their lives, their families, and their future prospects with the same systematic thoroughness they had used against him. The game had changed, but Curtis Hicks was still playing to win. And this time, he had the full resources of the United States government backing his quest for revenge. Chapter 7. The Manipulation. Curtis's first visit to Sandra in federal prison was carefully choreographed. He dressed casually, wore a melancholy expression, and carried himself like a man struggling with profound heartbreak. The performance began the moment he entered the visiting room. Sandra looked smaller in her prison uniform, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. When she saw Curtis, her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he almost believed her emotion was genuine. "Curtis," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again." Curtis sat across from her, maintaining the perfect balance between hurt and lingering affection. "I didn't want to come. My lawyer advised against it. But I needed to understand why, Sandra. I needed to hear it from you." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation on both sides. Sandra played the role of the remorseful woman who had made a terrible mistake, while Curtis portrayed himself as the wounded lover seeking closure. "I loved you, Curtis. I still love you. What happened with Damon, it was a moment of weakness that spiraled out of control. I never meant for it to go so far." Curtis leaned forward slightly, his voice soft with manufactured pain. "But it wasn't just an affair, Sandra. You shared information about my business, about my clients. That wasn't a moment of weakness. That was a betrayal of everything I trusted you with." Sandra's tears seemed genuine as she reached across the table toward his hands. "I was trying to help Damon with his investigation business. I thought if I could provide him with some general information, it would help him succeed, and then maybe I could convince him to end our relationship. I know it sounds crazy, but I was trying to find a way back to you." The lie was expertly crafted, containing just enough truth to be believable while obscuring the real purpose of her espionage. Curtis had to admit that Sandra was exceptionally skilled at her craft. "Sandra, the federal prosecutors are saying you could face 15 years in prison. Your lawyer has been calling my office, suggesting that I could testify on your behalf as a character witness." Hope flickered in Sandra's eyes. "Would you consider it?" "Curtis, I know I don't deserve your help, but—" "I don't know," Curtis interrupted, playing his role perfectly. "The woman I loved wouldn't have betrayed me like this. I'm not sure who you really are anymore." Over the next several visits, Curtis carefully rebuilt Sandra's trust while gathering crucial intelligence. She revealed details about how she had first been approached by someone claiming to be a freelance intelligence broker. The man had convinced her that corporate espionage was common in high-level business relationships, and that providing information about Curtis's clients would be financially lucrative for both of them. His name was Neil Malone, Sandra confided during their fourth visit. He said he worked for private security firms that needed competitive intelligence. He made it sound so legitimate, so normal. Curtis memorized every detail Sandra provided about Neil Malone, passing the information to his government handlers while privately planning his own response. Malone was the key to unraveling the entire network, and Curtis intended to personally ensure that he faced consequences for orchestrating the operation. "Sandra," Curtis said during their sixth visit, "I've been thinking about what you've told me, about how you were manipulated into this situation. Maybe you were as much a victim as I was." The relief on Sandra's face was palpable. "Curtis, do you really think so? I've been torturing myself, thinking about what I did to you, to us. I'm going to talk to my lawyer about testifying on your behalf," Curtis said, taking her hands in his. "But I need you to tell me everything about Neil Malone and anyone else who was involved. If you were manipulated, we need to prove it." Sandra's cooperation increased dramatically as she began to believe that Curtis might actually help her avoid a lengthy prison sentence. She provided detailed descriptions of her handlers, their methods of communication, and the specific information they had requested about Curtis's clients. But as Curtis gathered intelligence, he was also laying the groundwork for a more personal form of justice. Using his extensive network of contacts, he began to identify and track down every person involved in the operation against him. Neil Malone, it turned out, was a former CIA operative who had gone freelance after being forced out of the agency for ethical violations. He maintained residences in 3 different countries and operated under multiple identities. Through careful investigation, Curtis also identified 2 other operatives who had been involved in gathering intelligence about his business: Renee O'Neill, a computer specialist who had hacked his systems, and Joey Foley, a surveillance expert who had coordinated the physical observation of Curtis's daily routines. Each of these men had families, business interests, and personal vulnerabilities that Curtis's team cataloged with methodical precision. When the time came for revenge, Curtis would be able to strike at them in ways that would cause maximum suffering and lasting damage. The beauty of their situation, Curtis explained to Luther during one of their planning sessions, is that they can't go to law enforcement for protection. They're foreign intelligence operatives who have committed crimes against the United States. They're on their own. Luther studied the photographs and dossiers spread across Curtis's desk. These are dangerous people, Curtis. They won't just accept whatever punishment you have in mind. I'm counting on it, Curtis replied with a cold smile. I want them to fight back. I want them to escalate, because every action they take against me will justify everything I do to them. Curtis's plan was entering its final phase. He had gathered enough intelligence to satisfy his government handlers, and he had identified every person involved in the operation against him. Soon, Sandra and her handlers would learn what it meant to target Curtis Hicks. The war they had started was about to end, but not in the way they had anticipated. Chapter 8, The Final Gambit. Curtis's 8th visit to Sandra came 3 months after their first reunion. By now, she trusted him completely, believing that he was working with her attorneys to secure a reduced sentence. In reality, Curtis had been feeding information to federal prosecutors that would ensure she faced the maximum penalty for espionage. "Curtis, I have something important to tell you," Sandra said, her eyes bright with hope. "My lawyer thinks we might be able to plea bargain down to 5 years if you testify about how I was manipulated by Neil Malone." Curtis nodded sympathetically while internally savoring the irony. Sandra still believed she was facing corporate espionage charges, unaware that federal investigators had reclassified her crimes as espionage against the United States, which carried a potential life sentence. "Sandra, before I commit to testifying, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. I've told you everything." Curtis leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Is Sandra Grace your real name?" For just a moment, Sandra's composure cracked. The trained operative behind the girlfriend's mask flickered into view before she recovered her performance. "What do you mean?" "Of course it's my real name, because I've been having trouble sleeping, thinking about our relationship, and I started looking into your background more carefully. Some things don't add up, Sandra. Your college records, your employment history. There are gaps that don't make sense." Sandra's face paled, but she maintained her act. "Curtis, I don't understand what you're suggesting. Why would I lie about my identity?" Curtis studied her face with the cold analysis of a predator evaluating prey. "I think you know exactly what I'm suggesting. I think Sandra Grace is a carefully constructed identity, and I think everything about our relationship was planned from the beginning." The mask finally slipped completely. Sandra's posture changed, her expression hardened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a subtle accent that Curtis had never heard before. "You're more perceptive than my superiors gave you credit for," she said quietly. "But it doesn't matter what you think you know. I'm facing corporate espionage charges, nothing more." Curtis smiled, and Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his expression that she recognized from her training, the look of someone who held all the cards and was about to play them. "Sandra, or whatever your real name is, you're not facing corporate espionage charges. You're facing charges under the Espionage Act. The federal government knows exactly who you are and who you work for." The color drained from Sandra's face. "That's impossible. Is it? Did you really think I was stupid enough to fall for your act twice? Every conversation we've had in this room has been recorded. Every piece of information you've given me about Neil Malone and your handlers has been passed directly to federal intelligence agencies. Sandra sat back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. If Curtis was telling the truth, she wasn't just facing a long prison sentence. She was facing life imprisonment or potentially even execution for treason. "You used me," she whispered. Curtis's laugh was devoid of warmth. "I used you? Sandra, you spent 2 years of your life pretending to love me while stealing classified information that could have endangered American lives. You manipulated me, lied to me, and betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. And now you're upset because I turned the tables on you. Curtis, please." "Oh, I'm not finished yet," Curtis continued relentlessly. "While you've been sitting in here telling me about Neil Malone and your other associates, my people have been hunting them down. Malone is currently in a federal detention facility in Virginia, facing charges that will put him away for the rest of his life. Renee O'Neill was arrested in Budapest 3 days ago and is being extradited. Joey Foley. Well, Joey had an unfortunate accident in Prague that left him permanently disabled." Sandra's eyes widened in horror. "You had him attacked?" "I had him neutralized as a threat to American national security," Curtis corrected. "The difference is important from a legal standpoint. You can't do this. There are laws, international agreements." Curtis leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Sandra, you declared war on me when you walked into my life with orders to destroy it. You targeted my business, my clients, and my country. Did you really think I would just accept that quietly? What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand the full scope of what you've lost," Curtis replied. "Your real identity is Sylvia Holloway, born in Prague 34 years ago. You were recruited by Czech intelligence when you were 19 and have been operating in the United States for over a decade. Your handlers have been feeding information to Russian intelligence services, which means you're guilty of treason against the country that welcomed you." Sylvia stared at him in shock. The level of intelligence Curtis had gathered about her true identity was staggering. "Your parents in Prague have been arrested on suspicion of espionage. Your younger brother has been expelled from university and blacklisted from employment. Your handlers have either been captured or eliminated. The entire network you were part of has been systematically destroyed." Tears began streaming down Sylvia's face as the full magnitude of Curtis's revenge became clear. He hadn't just targeted her. He had destroyed everyone and everything connected to her operation. "But that's still not enough," Curtis continued. "You see, Sylvia, you made the mistake of trying to manipulate someone who doesn't forgive and doesn't forget. You thought you could play with my emotions, steal my secrets, and disappear back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Curtis stood up, preparing to leave. "You're going to spend the rest of your life in an American supermax prison, knowing that everyone you ever cared about has been destroyed because of your actions. And every day for the rest of your life, you're going to remember that Curtis Hicks kept his promise to make you pay for betraying him." As Curtis walked toward the exit, Sylvia called out desperately, "Curtis, wait. I can give you information about other operations, other agents." Curtis stopped and turned back to her. "Sylvia, I already have all the information I need. And frankly, I don't care about other operations. I only cared about the one that targeted me." He walked to the door, then paused one final time. "Oh, and Sylvia, the child you're carrying? The adoption has been arranged through an agency I control. The adoptive parents are good people who will raise him or her to be a loyal American citizen. Your bloodline will serve the country you tried to betray." The sound of Sylvia's anguished scream followed Curtis as he left the prison for the last time. Phase 1 of his revenge was complete, but the war was far from over. Neil Malone and the remaining members of the network were still breathing, and Curtis intended to correct that oversight. Chapter 9. The Reckoning Complete. 6 months later, Curtis sat in his office reading the final intelligence report on Operation Comeuppance, the codename the government had given to his systematic destruction of the espionage network. Every loose end had been tied up, every enemy neutralized, every threat eliminated. Neil Malone had been found dead in his federal detention cell, an apparent suicide by hanging. Curtis's contact in the prison system had ensured that Malone's final days were spent in constant fear, surrounded by inmates who had been carefully informed about his crimes against American service members. Renee O'Neill had suffered a different fate after his extradition to the United States. During transport from the airport, the convoy carrying him had been ambushed by unknown assailants. O'Neill's body was found 3 days later in a remote forest, bearing signs of extensive torture before his execution. The surviving members of the Czech intelligence cell that had targeted Curtis had either been arrested in coordinated raids across Europe or had simply disappeared. Those who remained alive faced decades in prison, their careers destroyed and their families disgraced. But Curtis's most satisfying victory was personal. His former sister Geraldine had finally understood the true cost of betraying family loyalty. Unable to cope with the social ostracism and financial pressure Curtis had orchestrated, she and Phil had lost their home, their savings, and their marriage. Geraldine now worked as a clerk in a discount store, living in a one-bedroom apartment and struggling to pay for basic necessities. The final intelligence assessment confirms that the entire network has been eliminated, Director Phillips reported during their concluding meeting. Your cooperation has been invaluable to national security, Mr. Hicks. Curtis accepted the government's gratitude with appropriate modesty, but privately he knew that national security had been a secondary concern. His primary objective had always been personal revenge, and, on that front, his success had been total. Sylvia Holloway, he refused to think of her as Sandra anymore, had been sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The child she had carried was born in the prison medical facility and immediately placed with the adoptive family Curtis had selected. The boy would grow up as an American citizen, never knowing that his biological mother was a foreign spy who had betrayed the country of his birth. Curtis's business had not only survived the intelligence breach, but had grown stronger. His cooperation with federal agencies had earned him exclusive contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Politicians, generals, and intelligence officials competed for his services, knowing that Curtis Hicks was a man who could be trusted to protect America's secrets. But the most important change was in Curtis himself. The man who had once believed in love, family, and the basic goodness of human nature no longer existed. In his place stood someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood that trust was a luxury he could never again afford. Curtis had learned to find satisfaction in solitude, to derive pleasure from the systematic destruction of his enemies, and to sleep peacefully knowing that anyone who betrayed him would face consequences that extended far beyond legal punishment. His phone buzzed with a text message from Daisy Clifford, a former military intelligence officer who had recently joined his firm. She was intelligent, capable, and beautiful. Everything Curtis might once have found attractive in a partner. But romance was a weakness he had eliminated from his life, along with trust and forgiveness. Curtis deleted the message without responding and returned to his work. There were contracts to review, threats to assess, and enemies to monitor. Somewhere in the world, other operatives were planning operations against American interests, and Curtis would be ready for them. He had become something that his enemies feared and his allies respected, a man without mercy, without sentiment, and without the vulnerabilities that had once made him a target. The price of that transformation had been everything he had once held dear, but Curtis considered it a fair trade. The war that had begun with Sandra's betrayal was finally over, and Curtis Hicks had won completely. His enemies were dead, imprisoned, or broken. His reputation was unassailable. His future was secure. And if that future would be spent alone, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone he had once loved and then destroyed, Curtis accepted that as the natural consequence of living in a world where betrayal was rewarded with annihilation. As the sun set over the city he had conquered and defended, Curtis Hicks smiled the cold smile of a man who had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged victorious. He had learned the most important lesson of all. In a world full of enemies and traitors, the only person you could truly trust was yourself. The reckoning was complete, and Curtis Hicks stood alone at the center of his empire, exactly as he had planned. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.